Well, now that we're in the sixth week, Unit 6 of Genesis 12 to 36 has a focus on an additional covenant passage, and in this case, of course, the covenant sign of circumcision. As the Abram, and soon to be called Abrahamic covenant unfolds in Genesis 12 through 17, the themes of blessing, land, and descendants continue to be rehearsed through the narrative. In this case, we're going to have the focus upon the aspect of descendants, especially in light of the chapter 16 birth of Hagar. We are told, of course, in the beginning of chapter 17 that Abram was 99 years of age when this new covenant promise is brought forth. The end of chapter 16, which focused again on the utilization of Hagar, a concubine, for the producing of an heir. Again, responsibilities of an heir in the world of the ancient, not much unlike what happens in many of our cultures in the modern world. Typically, what was the responsibility of the eldest son was several-fold. One was to provide for the well-being of the mother and father in their latter days of life, to properly care for. And second was to oversee the special process of burial. All cultures have very specific burial practices, as we'll see later in the narrative of Genesis 12 to 36. The purchasing of a cave, in this case from Ephron the Hittite, citizen of Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem, for a cave family burial. And in the Middle Bronze Age, we have numerous examples from archaeological research. Sometimes the caves are right near the city. Sometimes they're in perimeter hillsides where there are natural caves. And in most cases, people utilize natural caves for family burials. And even though the family may move around, you would bring the body back to the traditional family burial site. So properly caring for the aged, proper burial, and then, of course, the disposition of the goods, those various items that were held by the family trust, and to ensure the proper distribution among the multiple sons of the patriarchal family. So through Hagar, Ishmael, of course, is born. And that's, of course, at age 86. Chapter 17 is 13 years later. And remember, back in the beginning, Abraham departs, enters the land of Canaan when he's 75. 11 years later, after having adopted Eliezer of Damascus, the birth of a child through a concubine, Hagar, was the second means of normal Middle Eastern practices of procuring an heir, was through the use of a concubine. There's special responsibilities and deliberations, and again, following the traditional practices of the ancient world. Abraham is going through those steps. But the Lord has to remind him that I've got something even more amazing in line. And then again, 13 years later, in this context of the circumcision as a sign of the covenant, that which was to be the observable means by which one could be identified as a member of the covenant family of the descendants of Abram at this point. So God appears to the 99-year-old Abram in a dynamic way. And in this passage, as highlighted by most commentaries, it's the most dense use of the Hebrew word berit for covenant. More than a dozen times, covenant is utilized, either my covenant or the covenant or covenant between me and between your descendants, your seed. Numerous times those items are repeated throughout this passage. That, again, God has a way of setting forth this as a seal or sign of the covenant relationship. That this then instruction, which is kind of another aspect of this passage, in that Abram would become a father of many nations. Circumcision was widely practiced in the Middle East. It's not something that's unique. I posted up one article that I'd run across a while back on Egyptian circumcision, which was a little bit different style, in which the foreskin is split or in some cases partially removed. And again, we have descriptions verbally and pictorially of circumcision happening among males in Egyptian families. Other peoples practiced in the land of Canaan circumcision that we know about. And so one of the things we are kind of reminded of, remember that the Philistines were not circumcised, and they're highlighted as being an uncircumcised group of people. The Philistines, we know, came from the northern Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea area of what is the area around modern-day Greece, some from Cyprus, some from the island of Crete, and other Mediterranean islands. They are of Indo-European stock, and those people groups did not circumcise. And so, again, you remember the illustrious story of one of David's conquests was to bring back the removed foreskins of his conquered Philistine. So, again, circumcision now becomes that sign, seal, identifying element of the family of faith of Abraham. Now, the other thing to note about in the text, and I highlighted in the material that was posted up in the announcement for this section, was that it was not simply, that promised family that would come through Isaac, but as a matter of fact, the first person highlighted in the text, Abraham right after it, but Ishmael, who would go on to father many nations, as was promised to Hagar. He is first listed in the text. We have two different passages that talk about him in the text of Genesis 17, and then also, of course, Abraham. And of course, remember, Abraham is 86 when he is circumcised. But people also, outside of the descendants, many of those people that he had, again, as the text highlights, purchased slaves, persons bought for servicing the household of Abraham, are also to be circumcised. So it's not simply limited to direct descendants, whether through Ishmael, through the concubine Hagar, nor Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and down, but circumcision could be. But again, it's an identifier for the family of faith, those who are wanting to identify with this new faith tradition, as Abraham is that father of faith, highlighted back in Genesis 15, that which was his belief, his faith, which was reckoned to him as righteous. So, servants, foreigners, all were to be circumcised. Later on, we have also in the Pentateuch other people groups who want to identify with the faith of Israel. For example, in some of the Passover delineations in Numbers chapter 9, it talks about those people who want to celebrate Passover, an identifying aspect of Israelite faith tradition. They would need to be circumcised, and that's in those special delineations with regard to Passover celebration. Again, so you put circumcision together in the broad perspective, it is an identifying element in the family of faith of this new launching out in life that Abraham is fathering for humankind. Again, this identifiable evidence would serve as a boundary marker for those following in faith the potential of reaching out to the many nations that would come forth from Abraham. God's plan in the covenant unfolding in Genesis 12 to 17 then has a more universal scope to it. His design from the beginning, the call of Abraham, was that all of the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. So the next stage in the unfolding of the covenant promises here in Genesis chapter 17.